The road to Lebanon. Kansas looked like every other stretch of American. Nowhere. Cracked asphalt bleeding into flat horizon. Gas stations with burnout letters. Grain silos standing like forgotten sentinels. Against a sky the color of old pewter. It was the kind of place where nothing happened, and the locals preferred it that way. The sling ring tore open above a field half a mile outside of town at 2:47 in the morning. It wasn't the clean, geometric portal Stephen Strange was accustomed to. That precise golden mandala of rotating particles. Disciplined and architectural. Obedient to the laws he had spent years mastering under the Ancient One's unforgiving eye. This was something wrong. The opening came jagged, like a wound rather than a door. Its edges flickering between amber and a sickly violet that had no business existing in any dimensional spectrum. Strange had cataloged. It spat him out sideways, and he hit the Kansas earth hard enough to crack the frozen topsoil beneath him, his cloak of levitation snapping outward instinctively to slow the impact. He lay still for 3 seconds, breathed. The stars above were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not inverted constellations or twin moons. Nothing so obvious. Just slightly, cosmically wrong. The way a word looks strange after you've stared at it too long. Strange had traversed enough realities to trust that instinct. His fingers found the eye of Agamotto at his chest and pressed. Nothing. The familiar warmth of the time. Stone's resonance. That deep, amber hum that lived beneath the artifact. Like a second heartbeat was silent, absent, not suppressed, simply not recognized by whatever metaphysical framework governed this place. He sat up slowly, scanning the field. Flatland, fence posts, the distant orange smear of a grain elevator's security light. The air smelled like winter and iron and something faintly sulfuric that he initially attributed to the portal's blowback before realizing it was simply ambient, present in the soil itself, in the cold wind coming from the south. This universe smelled like something had been burning in it for a very long time. He rose, cataloging damage. The cloak was intact, rotating its collar with what he privately interpreted as concern. His hands, the scarred, trembling hands that had once been a surgeon's pride and were now something stranger, responded when he called a diagnostic glyph. Power present, magic accessible, but when the glyph formed, it formed thick, like drawing through resistance. And its color was off by precisely the shade that told him everything. The mystic substrate of this reality operated on different foundational laws, not incompatible, but foreign in the way that a language from the same root family is still, unmistakably, not your own. He had maybe 70% operational capacity, perhaps less, depending on what he tried to do. He had been attempting to close a dimensional fracture above Kamartaj, a hairline crack in reality's membrane caused by a particularly aggressive incursion from the empiricals, surviving constructs. The sling ring was supposed to anchor him to the sanctum's coordinates. Instead, something on the other side of the fracture had pulled, a gravitational wrongness he hadn't encountered before, and the portal had simply taken him somewhere it wanted him to go, rather than somewhere he'd chosen. Strange did not enjoy being taken places. He was orienting himself, pulling a localized perception spell to map nearby structures. When the black 1967 Chevrolet Impala materialized on the road at the field's edge with its headlights off, it had been running without lights for the last quarter mile, which told him that whoever was inside had seen the portal's light show from a distance and was experienced enough to approach dark. That was not a civilian behavior. The car stopped. 2 doors opened. 2 men got out. The taller one moved with the quiet, considered precision of someone who had been in many situations where moving wrong got people killed. He held a long, double-barreled shotgun with the casual competence of a man for whom firearms were vocabulary rather than tools. The shorter one, broader, jaw set like a man permanently prepared to be disappointed by the universe, had a pearl-handled Colt revolver. Strange recognized as old, very old, and almost certainly not standard ammunition. Hands, the shorter one said. His voice had the texture of gravel that had been rained on repeatedly. Strange looked at them. He looked at the weapons. He looked at the spread of sigils he could already see burned into the Impala's interior door. Frames, protective markings, old ones, layered over years, and understood immediately that these men were not afraid of him so much as they were. Experienced with things that came through. Lights in the sky at 3 a.m. He raised his hands. The cloak shifted. That a cape? The shorter one said. Cloak, Strange said. There's a distinction. Xana, witch, or something else? The taller one asked, and his tone was purely professional, not hostile, not curious, simply diagnostic. Strange considered his answer. In most universes, identifying yourself as a sorcerer to armed strangers who approached with preloaded weapons was suboptimal. But the sigils on the car, the silver he could smell on the shotgun shells, the specific way the taller man was watching his hands rather than his face, that was a trained observer watching for spell gestures. And lying to trained observers was usually more dangerous than the truth. Sorcerer, Strange said. Master of the mystic arts. I'm not from here, and by here, I mean this specific dimensional reality, not Kansas. Though that's also true. He lowered his hand slightly. I don't suppose either of you has a theory about what kind of gravitational dimensional anomaly could override a calibrated sling ring and deposit a man in a field in the Midwest. The shorter man looked at the taller one. Something passed between them in the economy of brothers who had been surviving together long enough to communicate in fractions. Silver, the shorter one said, and threw a flask. Strange caught it, opened it, poured a small amount on his hand. Nothing. Holy water, the taller one said, and threw a second flask, with the air of a man who had done this 3,000 times and found it tedious. Strange poured that on his other hand. Nothing. Huh, the shorter one said. He didn't lower the Colt. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. I'm Dean, the shorter one said finally. The word carrying the weight of a man who gave his name as a weapon sometimes. That's Sam. You want to tell us what exactly came through that light show out there? Or are we doing this the hard way? Stephen Strange looked at the two men standing in a Kansas field at 3 a.m. with silver and holy water and guns loaded with things he hadn't identified yet, wearing the particular exhaustion of people who had seen enough impossible things that one more had simply become Tuesday and felt something he hadn't expected in his assessment of this universe's danger level. He felt something close to recognition. Both options sound tedious, Strange said, and the cloak settled around his shoulders with what might have been agreement. But I'll take the conversation. The men of Letter's bunker existed beneath Lebanon like a secret the earth had decided to keep, reinforced concrete and arcane architecture, descended through 40 feet of Kansas bedrock. Its entrance a rusted metal door set into a hillside that looked like it led to a forgotten Cold War installation, which, in certain bureaucratic senses, it did. Strange followed the Winchesters down the iron stairs with the measured calm of a man who had walked through the dark dimension and found it architecturally uninspiring, cataloging everything with the same clinical precision that had once made him the most sought-after neurosurgeon on the eastern seaboard. The bunker was extraordinary, not in the way the Sanctum Sanctorum was. Extraordinary, that Victorian labyrinth of shifting rooms and anchored dimensional pockets, where the walls themselves were load-bearing magical infrastructure. This was extraordinary in the way of accumulated human knowledge pressed against the edges of things humanity was never designed to understand. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound volumes in 17 languages he could identify and 3 he couldn't. Warded filing cabinets. A war room table etched with a map of the continental United States and covered in pins of 4 different colors. The smell of old paper and gun oil and something herbal, sage, he identified, and cedar, and the faint chemical ghost of spilled holy water, dried into the concrete over years of use. Human beings had built this. Mortal, unaugmented. Human beings had assembled this repository and used it to fight things that should have annihilated them by actuarial probability alone. Strange found that quietly remarkable and filed it away. Dean dropped into a chair at the war room table with the boneless efficiency of a man whose body had learned to rest in any available window because windows closed. Without warning, he kept the Colt on the table within reach, not pointed, but present, a statement rather than a threat. Sam moved to the shelves with purpose. pulling volumes with the comfortable familiarity of a researcher who knew his collection. "So," Dean said, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a ceramic mug that said, "World's okayest hunter," and not offering any to Strange, Sorcerer Supreme. "The Sorcerer Supreme," Strange corrected, taking the chair across from him without being invited. The cloak arranged itself over the chair back with quiet dignity. "There's only one at a time. It's a specific title, right?" Dean looked at the cloak with the expression of a man who had seen stranger things, but was still cataloging. "This one for later mockery. And your cloak is sentient. Partially. Don't patronize it. It holds grudges." Dean looked at the cloak. The cloak's collar rose approximately 1 inch. Dean looked back at Strange, with the expression of a man updating his threat assessment in real time. Sam set 3 volumes on the table and opened a laptop. "Masters of the Mystic Arts," he said, not looking up, fingers already moving. "Men of Letters" has references, mostly European, 17 and 1800s. There's a Sanctum Sanctorum, mentioned in a 1892 deposition, from a hunter named Petrova who encountered a practitioner in New York, described as, he squinted at the screen, wielding mandalas of golden light and speaking in a tongue that was neither Latin nor Enochian, but carried the weight of both. "Accurate enough," Strange said. "The deposition also says she tried to kill him with a silver knife and he looked annoyed. Also accurate, I imagine." Sam looked up then, and Strange caught the full weight of the younger Winchester's attention for the first time. That particular quality of intelligence that had clearly been trained against things that lied convincingly for a living and had developed a finely calibrated sensor for inconsistency. It was, Strange noted, not unlike the way Wong looked at grant applications for Camartage resources. "Your magic," Sam said carefully. "It's not demonic. It's not angelic. Holy water and silver don't affect you, but you're not human baseline either. There's something in the way you move, the way you held that diagnostic glyph outside. It's structured, academic." He paused. "Where does it come from?" Strange considered how to compress a decade of dimensional cosmology into terms that would be immediately useful to a man whose magical framework was built on entirely different foundations. "In my reality, magic is a discipline," he said, "drawn from the dimensional energy of the multiverse itself, other realities, other planes of existence, accessed through study and practice and the development of genuine understanding. It's not granted by any deity or entity. It's not transactional. It doesn't require sacrifice or faith or negotiation." He paused, feeling the specific quality of this universe pressing against that last sentence like a thumb against a bruise. "Here, I suspect that's different. Here," Dean said, "everything costs something." The simplicity of it landed with unexpected weight. Strange looked at him and recognized that Dean Winchester had not said that as philosophy. He had said it as biography. Sam pulled a worn leather journal from a shelf, different from the Men of Letters volumes, older, more personal, its cover dark with handling, and set it open to a page of cramped handwriting, alongside a detailed pencil sketch. "Our dad kept records of practitioners he encountered," he said. "Most of them were working with demonic assistance or accessing power through pagan channels. The ones who weren't," he tapped a passage, "tended to either burn out catastrophically or draw attention from things they couldn't handle." "What kind of things?" Strange asked, though he already suspected. "Angels," Sam said. "Demons. Things older than both." He met Strange sighs. "This isn't a universe that lets power go unnoticed, especially power that doesn't fit the established hierarchy. Heaven and hell both have taxonomies, categories they use to understand what they're dealing with. Something that doesn't fit the taxonomy gets flagged." Strange processed this with the part of his mind that was always running threat assessments. His arrival had not been quiet. The portal's spectral signature alone would have registered across whatever monitoring systems this universe's supernatural factions employed. He had approximately, he estimated, a limited window before those factions sent representatives to investigate. As if in confirmation, Dean's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and his jaw tightened by a fraction. "Cass is 20 minutes out," he said to Sam. Then, to Strange, "Our angel. He felt something when you came through." described it as, Dean checked the text, a frequency consistent with celestial transit, but originating from an impossible direction. He set the phone down. He's going to want to look at you. I've been examined by entities considerably more imposing than angels, Strange said. Dean's expression suggested this was the wrong kind of confidence to display before meeting Castiel. Sam had returned to the archives, cross-referencing with the speed of genuine scholarly training rather than simply searching for immediate answers. Strange watched him work and recognized the specific intellectual hunger of someone who had turned to knowledge as both weapon and comfort, a mirror he did not particularly enjoy looking into. Your eye of Agamotto, Sam said without looking up, nodding toward Strange's chest. The amulet. It's not responding to this reality. The artifact it houses, the time stone, has no resonance here, Strange said. Whatever force governs time in this universe doesn't communicate with it. The eye still functions as a focusing instrument, but the primary capability is dormant. Dean leaned forward at that. Time stone, he repeated. You can manipulate time. In my reality. Not here. Not currently. Something crossed Dean Winchester's face, quick, complex, and immediately suppressed, that Strange catalogued carefully. It was the expression of a man who had a complicated and deeply personal relationship with the concept of time manipulation, and who was deciding whether to be relieved or troubled that the stranger at his table didn't currently have access to it. Strange filed that too. Here's what I want to know, Dean said, and his voice had dropped into the register of a man asking the question that actually mattered to him, stripped of the procedural testing they'd been doing since the field. Whatever brought you here? Was it an accident, or did something pull you? Strange looked at him steadily. Both, he said, and I don't yet know what the second part means. The bunker's heavy door groaned at the top of the stairs. The sound of wings, not physical, not quite, but the atmospheric pressure shift of arrival, filled the stairwell. Dean didn't reach for the Colt. Sam didn't look up from the journal. A man in a rumpled trench coat descended the stairs with the bearing of something that had chosen that body carefully and still hadn't entirely learned how to inhabit it gracefully. His eyes found Strange immediately, not the way human eyes found a new person in a room, by process of scanning, but directly, completely, as though Strange had been the only thing in the room worth looking at since before the angel had opened the door. Castiel stopped at the base of the stairs. The silence stretched 4 full seconds, which in Strange's experience was an eternity in a room with armed people. You, Castiel said finally, with the particular tone of celestial bewilderment, are not supposed to exist. Strange looked at the angel, at the profound certainty in those ancient eyes, and felt the first genuine unease he'd experienced since arriving. That, he said carefully, has been said to me before. It's never been good news. Castiel looked at Strange, the way astronomers looked at objects that violated known physics, not with fear exactly, but with the particular focused intensity of a mind recalibrating everything it thought it understood about the shape of the universe. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Strange with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned that human furniture was a social gesture as much as a physical accommodation, and he folded his hands on the war room table and simply stared. Strange had been stared at by the Ancient One, by Dormammu, in 14 million iterations of the same moment, by the living tribunals, proxies, and by entities that perceived human consciousness the way humans perceived bacteria, present, technically, but not the point. He was accustomed to being examined by things larger than himself. Castiel's examination was different. It was intimate in a way. That cosmic scrutiny wasn't. It went inward rather than outward, down through the layers of what Strange was rather than cataloging what he could do. It was, he realized after a moment, the angelic equivalent of reading a soul. He let it happen. Resistance would have been both undignified and informative to the wrong party. You've been to hell, Castiel said. Not an accusation. A notation. Several variants, Strange confirmed. Dormammu's dark dimension has been compared to hell by people who've experienced both. Though I'd argue the comparison flatters Dormammu. I've also passed through dimensions that human religious frameworks would map onto hellscape topography. Yes. Not this hell, Castiel said. Not Lucifer's cage. Not the pit. A different one. Many different ones. He paused. And something moved behind his eyes, that deep, pre-human cognition surfacing briefly through the vessel. You carry the memory of darkness without being consumed by it. That is, he searched for the word with the slight delay of a being, translating concepts across an enormous gap. Unusual. He's not a demon and he's not an angel, Dean said from across the table, in the tone of a man contributing to a technical briefing. We established that with the water and the silver. What is he, Cass? A practitioner, Castiel said, but not of this world's magic. The power he carries doesn't originate from any source. I can identify within this reality's framework. It's not demonic. It's not divine, not of any divinity I recognize. It doesn't come from a pagan channel or a natural source. He looked directly at Strange. It comes from somewhere else entirely. From outside. From another universe, Sam said. He had stopped pretending to read and was watching Castiel with the alert attention of someone receiving a diagnosis. His magic is dimensional. He draws from the multiverse itself. Castiel processed this with visible effort. Not the effort of incomprehension, but of someone stretching a framework built over millions of years to accommodate a concept it was never designed to include. The multiverse, he said slowly. We are aware of alternate realities. Heaven's records include anomalies, moments where the membrane between worlds thinned and things passed through. But this universe's cosmology is, he paused again, proprietary. Heaven and hell operate within a specific structured hierarchy. God's creation. The natural laws here were written deliberately. By Chuck, Dean said, with the specific bitterness of a man using a name as a profanity. Strange noted that and decided not to pursue it immediately. What I'm hearing, Strange said, is that I've arrived in a closed cosmological system, one with defined metaphysical governance, divine and infernal hierarchies, established rules about what power is and where it comes from. He looked at Castiel, and my presence violates the taxonomy. Yes, Castiel said simply, which means both heaven and hell now have an anomalous reading they need to explain. Almost certainly, and explaining it, from their perspective, likely means either categorizing me within their existing framework or eliminating the thing that won't categorize, Sam finished. He said it quietly, without drama, the way a man states a fact he has personal experience with. Strange considered the tactical landscape. He was operating at reduced capacity in a reality governed by rules he didn't fully understand yet. His primary time manipulation capability was offline. His portal generation was unstable, and he had attracted the attention of at least two major supernatural power structures within approximately 40 minutes of arrival. On the positive side, he had found 3 people who were demonstrably experienced, knowledgeable, and had not yet attempted to kill him, which in his experience put them in a statistically rare category. Tell me about the angelic response structure, he said. How quickly do they move? How many? And what are their primary capabilities against a target like me? Dean looked at Sam. Sam looked at Castiel. Castiel looked at Strange with an expression that contained strange thought, the ghost of something that might have been appreciation for the directness. Angels in full garrison can mobilize quickly, Castiel said. Their primary offensive capability is smiting, divine light that destroys demons and can kill humans. Against something that is neither, he tilted his head. The effect is unclear. Their angel blades can kill angels and demons. Against you specifically, I don't know. Silver and holy water did nothing, Dean noted. So standard anti-supernatural arsenal is off the table. My shields will handle conventional angelic assault, Strange said, with more certainty than he fully felt, provided they're not hitting me with something that operates on a frequency my magic doesn't recognize, which, given what you've said about this universe's power framework, is a non-trivial risk. He brought his hands together slowly, generating a diagnostic construct between his scarred palms, a rotating analytical glyph that mapped the ambient magical field of the room. It came slower than it should have, thicker, that same resistant quality he'd felt in the field. But it came. The glyph read the bunker's warding, the layers of protective sigils, burned and painted, and carved into the infrastructure, over years of accumulated hunter caution, and Strange let the information flow through him. The warding was genuinely impressive, designed by people who understood that the things they were warding against were intelligent and adaptive and had been breaching human defenses for millennia. He found himself revising upward his assessment of the men of letters. Institutional knowledge. Your sigils, he said, letting the glyph dissolve. The ones on the door, the walls there. Effective against entities that operate within your universes. Established power hierarchy. Angels, demons, things that draw from recognized supernatural sources. They won't do much against something from outside that hierarchy. We know, Sam said. Which is why Cass is our best early warning system right now. There's something else, Castiel said. He had not looked away from Strange throughout the entire exchange. That reading the sole quality of his attention continuous and steady. When I reached out to sense your presence before arriving. When I felt the dimensional transit signature. I was not the only one who noticed. The quality of silence in the room shifted. Demons? Dean asked. Possibly. But what I felt respond. Castiel paused with the hesitation of a being choosing words carefully because the wrong ones would cause panic that wouldn't be useful. Was older than the current demonic hierarchy. Something that was already aware of dimensional anomalies before I was. Something that found the concept of a multiverse. Another pause. Appetizing. Strange's hands had stilled. Define appetizing. There are things in this universe that consume power, Castiel said. Not demons. Not angels. Older. The empty is one, the void that existed before. God's creation, where angels and demons go when they die, if they die truly. It is aware. Occasionally, it extends attention into the living world when something disrupts it. He met Strange's eyes steadily, a being whose power comes from dimensional sources it has never encountered would be novel to it. An ancient, aware void that is now interested in me, Strange said. Potentially, Castiel said. Additionally, there is Amara, God's sister. The darkness. She has been. He glanced at Dean with an expression that carried the weight of considerable, complicated history, quiescent. But she perceives power in ways that defy our understanding. Your arrival may have registered to her as well. Dean stood up, moved to the kitchen alcove, with the energy of a man who needed to be doing something with his hands, and started making coffee with the focused attention of someone performing a ritual. So, he said to the coffee maker, we've got maybe angels incoming. Possibly something older than angels. And the freaking darkness potentially window shopping. That's a Tuesday. It's Thursday, Sam said. I know what day it is, Sam. Strange watched Dean Winchester make coffee at 2 in the morning with potential cosmic forces orienting toward the bunker and felt, with sudden clarity, exactly what kind of universe he had fallen into. Not a universe governed by the grand abstractions of dimensional mathematics and the cold geometry of mystic law. A universe governed by something messier and more dangerous. By people who had looked at impossible odds so many times that impossible had simply become the baseline, and who kept moving anyway, not because they had a plan, but because stopping was the one thing they'd never learned to do. It was, he thought, either admirable or catastrophic. Possibly both. I need to understand the full scope of what I'm dealing with, he said. The hierarchy. Heaven's current operational structure. Hell's leadership. Any active threats already in motion before my arrival. And I need to understand your magic. He looked at Sam. The kind hunters use. Not academic magic. The practical, functional kind. Sam and Castiel exchanged a look. That's going to take a while, Sam said. I can feel something moving at the edges of this reality's awareness. Strange said. So I'd suggest we make it a short while. Outside the bunker, 40 feet of Kansas bedrock above them. The night had gone completely still. No wind. No insects. The particular, weighted silence that the Winchesters both recognized and Strange was learning to recognize. The silence that meant something was listening. Rowena McLeod arrived uninvited, which was the only way she ever arrived anywhere. She came through the bunker's side entrance at 4:30 in the morning, using a key she had obtained through methods Dean had explicitly told her not to obtain methods through, wearing a forest green coat with a fur collar and carrying a leather satchel that clinked with the specific sound of glass vials in careful arrangement. She descended the stairs without hurrying, because Rowena McLeod had never hurried toward anything in 400 years of living, and did not intend to start now. And she stopped at the base of the stairs and looked across the war room at Strange with an expression that Strange had encountered before on exactly two other faces in his life. The Ancient One, in his first week of training, and Wong, the first time Strange had successfully held the shields of the Seraphim, construct for longer than 30 seconds. Pure, undisguised, immediately calculating covetousness. "Oh my," Rowena said softly, in the specific register of a woman who had found something she intended to have. "What have we here?" "Rowena," Dean said, with the tone of a man who had long ago moved past the phase of being surprised by her appearances and arrived at simple, resigned acknowledgement. "How did you?" "I felt it from Edinburgh," she said, not looking at Dean. She was walking toward Strange with the measured pace of a connoisseur, approaching a piece she was already planning to acquire. "A power signature unlike anything I have encountered in 4 centuries of practice. Not demonic, not divine, something structured and vast and geometrically precise." She stopped 3 feet from Strange and tilted her head, red hair catching the bunker's overhead light, like mathematics made into fire. She smiled, and it was a beautiful smile with considerable danger living behind it. "Who are you, darling?" "Stephen Strange," he said. "Sorcerer Supreme." "Of where?" "A different universe entirely." Rowena absorbed this with the equanimity of a woman who had survived Lucifer, the Grand Coven's excommunication, her own death and resurrection, and 4 centuries of supernatural politics. "Of course you are," she said, as though this were simply the most interesting Tuesday, Thursday she'd had in recent memory. She turned to Sam. "Why didn't you call me immediately? Something like this comes through, and you're sitting here doing archive work." "We were assessing the situation," Sam said. "You were being cautious," Rowena said, with the particular Scottish disdain she reserved for caution. She set her satchel on the war room table and began unpacking it with the efficiency of long practice, vials of ingredients. Strange partially recognized and partially didn't. A worn grimoire with a broken spine, several loose pages covered in a notation system he needed approximately for seconds to identify as a sophisticated personal cipher. "I've been developing a translation framework for cross-traditional magical systems for the better part of a decade," she said to Strange, the sales pitch so smoothly, embedded in casual conversation, that he suspected she'd been composing it since Edinburgh. "If your magic operates on different foundational principles than this universe's system, there are going to be interference patterns, resonance conflicts. Your spells will work, but they'll work badly. And occasionally, they'll work in ways you didn't intend, because this reality's magical substrate will try to process them according to its own grammar." Strange looked at her with genuine attention for the first time. "You understand cross-traditional magical interference." "I understand that magic is a language, and that all languages have grammar, and that foreign grammar introduced into a native speaker's sentence produces." She waved a hand elegantly. "Complications. That's a more sophisticated framework than I expected to find here." Rowena's smile sharpened considerably. "I am considerably more sophisticated than anyone expects, Dr. Strange. It's one of my most useful qualities." She opened the grimoire to a page covered in diagrammatic notation. "Now, walk me through the foundational mechanics of your system. Not the spells, the substrate. What is your magic drawing from, precisely?" Strange looked at her for a moment, measuring, as he measured everyone, the specific gravity of their intentions and the gap between what they said and what they wanted. Rowena McLeod wanted his knowledge. That was transparent and absolute, and she wasn't pretending otherwise, which he found more trustworthy than pretense would have been. What she intended to do with it was the more relevant question. "Dimensional energy," he said. "The multiverse generates power as a byproduct of its own existence. Trained practitioners learn to perceive, access, and shape that energy. The training is rigorous and takes years and involves genuine cognitive and perceptual restructuring." He paused. "It can't be simply transferred." "I'm not asking you to transfer it," Rowena said, and the mild offense in her voice was entirely genuine. "I'm asking you to describe it. There's a difference between wanting to steal your house and wanting to understand architecture a beat. I may also want to steal your house, but the architectural interest is real and primary." Despite himself, Strange almost smiled. Sam had been cross-referencing Rowena's grimoire notation against the men of letters archives and looked up with the expression he wore when disparate pieces of information were converging into something he didn't like. Rowena, he said carefully, when you felt his signature from Edinburgh, how did you feel it? What specifically registered? Rowena paused in her unpacking. The pause was brief, but Strange caught it. A half-second recalibration of what she'd been about to say. Power, she said. Simply power on a scale. That's not what I'm asking, Sam said. Did anything else feel it at the same time? When you reached out toward the signature, was there something already there? The quality of Rowena's stillness changed. It became the stillness of a very old, very experienced survivor, recognizing that a conversation had arrived somewhere serious. There was she chose the word with care, presence, at the edges, not angelic, not demonic, something that doesn't have proper taxonomy in my grimoire, which is comprehensive. She looked at Castiel. The empty, possibly, Castiel said. But the empty typically doesn't extend attention toward living practitioners. It waits. He paused. What I sensed was more hungry, more immediate. Describe it, Strange said. Have you ever encountered an entity that exists specifically to consume power that doesn't belong to a given reality? Castiel asked. An antibody. Something this universe generates when foreign metaphysical material enters its system. Strange had gone very still. A reality's immune response, he said. In a sense. He looked at Castiel steadily. In my universe, there are entities called mindless ones. Dimensional predators that exist in the spaces between realities. What you're describing sounds structurally similar, something that patrols the membrane and responds to breaches. He paused, working through the implications. If this universe has an equivalent, my arrival didn't just attract attention from heaven and hell. It activated a response from the reality itself. Which would explain, Sam said quietly, why the warding outside has been registering micro-fluctuations for the last 40 minutes. Everyone looked at the bunker's monitoring system. A series of sigil-based detection arrays wired into the infrastructure that Dean had spent 3 weeks installing after a particularly bad experience with demons finding the bunker through supernatural triangulation. The readings were subtle. Tiny variations in the ward field's baseline resonance. The metaphysical equivalent of a seismograph, catching tremors too small to feel, but too regular to be random. Something was circling. Right? Dean said, standing. He had the Colt in his hand with the fluid economy of someone for whom the gun was a natural extension of decision. So we've got angels triangulating, something old and hungry circling the warding. And he looked at Rowena, you broadcasting a homing signal by reaching out toward him from Scotland. Rowena had the grace to look fractionally guilty. I dampened it when I arrived. Dampened, not stopped. I was in a hurry. You just said you never hurry. I made an exception, Rowena said, with perfect dignity. Strange was already on his feet, the cloak rising with him, his scarred hands tracing the first geometry of a perceptual ward, something to extend his awareness beyond the bunker's walls and map what was outside. The spell came through that resistant thickness he was learning to work with, like pushing through deep water, but it came, and he spread it outward through 40 feet of rock and into the Kansas night above. What he found was not one thing circling. It was 3 things at different distances and with different qualities of attention. One with the cold, hierarchical certainty of divine origin, one with the sulfuric warmth of infernal intelligence, and one with neither, with something that had no temperature at all and was simply present the way darkness was present, not as a thing, but as an absence that had learned to be deliberate. He withdrew the spell and looked at the Winchesters and Castiel and Rowena with the assessment already calculated. We have approximately 11 minutes before the first of them tests. The warding directly, he said. The angelic signature will arrive first. It's moving with purpose and trajectory. The demonic one is hanging back, observing, which means it's either patient or waiting for the angel to engage. First and reveal information. He paused. The third one. What's the third one? Dean asked. Strange considered how to accurately convey what his perceptual spell had touched at the outermost edge, that total, temperature-less, waiting non-presence that had felt less like an entity approaching, and more like the concept of approach suddenly, becoming aware of itself. The third one, he said carefully, I don't have a category for yet, but it's the one I'd worry about. Rowena had her grimoire open and was writing with rapid, precise strokes. Sam was pulling weapons from the bunker's armory alcove with practiced speed. Castiel had straightened, in his chair with the quality of stillness that Strange was learning meant an angel, preparing to potentially fight other angels, which carried its own specific weight of reluctance and resolution. Dean Winchester looked at Strange with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a man who had survived long enough to trust his instincts about people in crisis situations. Can you fight? He asked. Not can you use magic, can you fight? The distinction was precise and intentional. Yes, Strange said. Good, Dean said, checking the Colt cylinder. Because in about 10 minutes we're probably going to need everybody. The angel came through the bunker's roof. Not through the door. Not through the warding seams. Through the reinforced concrete itself. The way light comes through a closed eye. As though the material world were a suggestion it had considered and declined. It arrived in the war room as a pressure change and a sound like a sustained organ. Note pitched below human hearing, but felt in the sternum. And it wore a woman's body, late 30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing what appeared to be a gray business suit that somehow conveyed military rank. Without insignia, its eyes were its own eyes for exactly 1 second before they went white. Completely, the way a screen goes white when the signal overwhelms it. Castiel was on his feet before it fully materialized. Ishim, he said, and the name carried history. Old, painful history. The kind that lived in the body rather than the mind. Castiel, the angel said, and its voice had that quality. Strange had encountered in certain dimensional entities, layered, more than one frequency occupying the same sound. It looked at Castiel with the specific contempt of a superior officer, who had never forgiven a subordinate for developing a conscience. Then it looked at Strange. This is what caused the transit signal. This, Strange said pleasantly, has a name. Ishim ignored him with the thoroughness of someone who had spent millennia deciding what qualified as worth acknowledging. The heavenly host has registered a foreign metaphysical presence operating within this reality without sanction, it said, in the tone of someone reading from a document. The presence draws from power sources outside God's creation and therefore outside legitimate jurisdictional frameworks. Heaven's position is that such a presence constitutes an uncontrolled variable in a system that has already sustained a fractional pause that contained, Strange sensed, considerable institutional trauma, significant structural damage. The presence is to be contained and studied, or, if containment proves impractical, neutralized. Neutralized, Dean repeated. He had the Colt leveled. You're in our house, and you just said neutralized. The Colt will not function against a full-ranked angel. Dean Winchester, Ishim said, without looking at him. I know that, Dean said. I'm making a point about hospitality. Strange was running a quiet analysis behind the conversation, his scarred fingers tracing small geometries at his side, mapping Ishim's power signature, the specific frequency of its divine energy, the way this universe's celestial power differed from dimensional energy he was accustomed to working with. It was wholly light fundamentally, operating on a frequency that his shields were not specifically calibrated to deflect. Not his shields as a concept, his shields as currently instantiated in a reality, whose magical substrate didn't fully recognize his spell forms. He adjusted 3 parameters in his shield geometry in real time, weaving the modification into the existing construct, the way a musician adjusts tuning mid-performance, and felt the shield settle into slightly better resonance with the local framework. I have a question, Strange said to Ishim. Purely procedural. Heaven's jurisdictional framework. Does it extend to beings who arrived here involuntarily and are actively attempting to leave? Or does it apply exclusively to beings who chose to operate here? Ishim looked at him for the first time with something other than categorical dismissal. It was the look of an entity encountering a legal argument it hadn't anticipated, needing to address. The origin of the transit is irrelevant, too. It's extremely relevant, Strange said. I didn't choose this universe. I'm not operating here as a competitor to your hierarchy or a challenger to your authority. I'm a traveler whose navigation failed and who is attempting to correct that failure, detaining or neutralizing A traveler whose presence is involuntary creates a precedent with implications for every dimensional transit. Anomaly your monitoring system has ever flagged. He paused. I'm also, in my home reality, an attorney. Different specialization than medicine, but the skills transfer. Sam made a small sound that might have been surprise. Dean's expression suggested he was reassessing Strange upward. Castile stepped forward, placing himself at an angle that was not quite between Strange and Ishim, but that communicated protective intent through geometry alone. Ishim, Heaven's current position on unauthorized entities has been wrong before. Consistently wrong. In ways that created larger problems than the unauthorized entity itself. Your opinion on Heaven's positions carries diminishing weight, Castile. My opinion on Heaven's positions has a demonstrable track record of being correct, Castile said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been exiled and reinstated enough times to have stopped finding either state particularly meaningful. The standoff held for 4 seconds. Strange used those 4 seconds productively, extending his awareness downward through the bunker's foundation. The demonic signature he'd mapped earlier had moved. It was no longer hanging back at a cautious distance. It had repositioned closer with the specific, directional quality of something that had been waiting for a distraction and had found one. We have a secondary problem, Strange said, without inflecting urgency into it, because inflecting urgency tended to accelerate situations in unproductive directions. The demonic presence that was observing from approximately a quarter-mile south has used the last 3 minutes to reposition to approximately 40 yards from the east wall. Dean moved immediately, the tactical recalibration of a man for whom splitting attention between simultaneous threats was fundamental muscle memory. Sam, already on it, Sam said, moving toward the armory. Ishim's white eyes tracked Strange with sudden sharpened interest. You can detect the demonic presence? I can detect most things that generate supernatural energy signatures. Yes, Strange said, including, currently, the fact that what just came through your warding's east side isn't a standard demon. He completed the analysis as he spoke it. The sulfuric signature has an upper register that reads more like. He searched his newly acquired understanding of this universe's taxonomy. A prince of hell than a standard crossroads or black-eyed class. The name registered across 3 faces simultaneously, with 3 different qualities of concern. Castile's was the measured recognition of knowing what a prince of hell meant tactically. Sam's was the deeper, more personal recognition of someone with specific history with that category of entity. Dean's was the particular tightening around the eyes of a man who had buried more people than he intended to and was calculating how not to bury more. Rowena, who had been silent for the last 4 minutes in the specific productive silence of a woman preparing something complicated, looked up from her grimoire. I have a binding that will hold a prince of hell for approximately 12 minutes, she said. It requires a blood component, and it will announce my position to everything supernatural within a 2-mile radius. But given that we already have an angel in the war room and a prince of hell testing the east wall, I'm not certain our position is a secret worth protecting. Do it, Dean said. I'll need, she looked at Strange, his blood. Specifically, the foreign dimensional signature will make the binding stronger. A prince of hell won't have encountered it before and won't have a prepared counter. Strange looked at her steadily. You want my blood for a spell? A small amount, Rowena said, with the specific tone of a woman who found negotiating for blood components slightly tedious but understood. It was socially necessary. A few drops. The binding operates on the principle that novel supernatural signatures are inherently confusing. To infernal entities, it's like introducing an immune response to a pathogen. It's never cataloged. Strange extended his left hand without further discussion. Rowena produced a small silver lancet. With the practiced efficiency of someone who did this regularly, took 3 drops onto a piece of prepared parchment, and returned to her grimoire with the focused speed of genuine expertise. The east wall shuddered. Not physically, not a structural shudder. No dust from the ceiling, no cracking of concrete. A metaphysical shudder. The warding straining against something pressing against it with intelligent, exploratory force. The detection array's readings spiked sharply upward. It's testing the warding's logic, Strange said, watching the readings. Looking for the underlying principle and probing for exceptions. This is a patient intelligence. They're all patient, Sam said grimly, returning with a demon-killing knife and a sawed-off shotgun loaded with rock salt shells. They've got eternity. Ishim had not moved from its position in the war room, and Strange noted with clinical interest that the Angel had also not left, had not, despite its stated mandate to contain or neutralize the foreign presence, made any aggressive move while the demonic threat was active. Institutional antagonism apparently had its operational limits. Even angels, it seemed, had priorities. "You're binding," Ishim said to Rowena, with the stiff discomfort of an angel acknowledging a witch's contribution. "Will it hold against a prince of hell's full capacity?" 12 minutes, as I said, Rowena replied, not looking up. "After which we'll need an alternate solution." She looked pointedly at Strange. "Which is where our multiversal visitor's power level becomes relevant. What can you actually do?" Dr. Strange, in this reality, at current capacity, against something operating at Prince of Hell strength? Strange brought his hands together, feeling the resistant thickness of this universe's substrate, the dimensional energy moving like cold honey rather than the responsive, immediate current he was accustomed to. He built a shield construct, layered, the inner layer calibrated to his own system, the outer layer adjusted to resonate with local magical frequencies in the modification he'd worked during Ishim's arrival. Then he added a third layer, experimental, using what he'd absorbed from watching Rowena's notation system and Castiel's power signature as reference points for this reality's specific frequencies. The triple-layer construct held. It was imperfect, and it cost more concentration than it should have, but it held. "Against a Prince of Hell," Strange said, "I can contain, restrict, and potentially bind. Whether I can destroy depends on whether destruction requires compliance with this reality's power hierarchy." He paused. "I'd prefer to avoid finding out the hard way. Ideally," Dean said, moving to the east wall with the shotgun. "We find out the easy way." The warding's east section went dark, all its sigils simultaneously extinguished, like candles in a sudden wind, and the wall didn't break. It simply stopped being a barrier. Something stepped through it the way Ishim had come through the ceiling, as though the material world had simply agreed to make an exception, and stood in the bunker's eastern corridor in a body that was too still, too composed, wearing a smile that was doing the work of a dozen different threats. Simultaneously, the Prince of Hell looked at the room, at Castiel, at the Winchesters, at Rowena with her prepared binding, at Ishim with its white eyes, and then it looked at Strange, with the specific quality of attention that Strange recognized across every universe he'd ever visited. Hunger wearing patience as a mask. "Dr. Strange," it said, in a voice like a contract being signed. "We've been wanting to talk to you since the moment you arrived. Hell has a proposition, and I think you'll find the terms." The smile widened fractionally, more agreeable than heaven's. The Prince of Hell's name was Asmodeus, or it was wearing Asmodeus like a code it had selected for this particular meeting. Strange had already learned enough about this universe's infernal hierarchy to understand that names here were simultaneously more and less stable than names in his own reality. It stood in the bunker's eastern corridor with the physical composure of something that had been practicing human stillness for so long it had forgotten there was ever any other way to hold a body, and it looked at Strange with that patient, acquisitive attention and waited for the room to finish reacting to its entrance. The room reacted efficiently. Dean had the Colt on Asmodeus before the prince had finished speaking, though both of them understood the Colt's effectiveness against a prince of hell was limited. Sam had moved to a flanking position with the demon-killing knife, which had more genuine utility, and both of them knew it. Castiel had generated a blade of his own from nowhere, visible, and held it with the specific grip of a being that had been in celestial combat since before Kansas existed as a geological feature. Rowena had the binding parchment in one hand and was completing the last notation with her other, her expression the focused composure of a woman who had learned that showing alarm in front of entities that fed on it was simply bad practice. Ishim had not moved, which Strange noted. The angel was watching Asmodeus with cold institutional hatred. Heaven and hell's mutual Animosity operating on a level below. Individual strategic calculation. But it had not attacked, which confirmed Strange's assessment that whatever Asmodeus represented in the current infernal hierarchy, it was at a power level that even a ranked angel treated with tactical caution. Strange himself had not moved at all. He was thinking. A proposition, he said to Asmodeus. From hell. From interested parties within hell, Asmodeus said, with the precision of someone who had spent centuries crafting language that was simultaneously true and designed to obscure hell's current administrative structure is. A brief pause that managed to convey considerable institutional politics in the space of a breath. In transition, there are factions. I represent one with a particular interest in dimensional mechanics. In me, Strange said. In what you represent, Asmodeus said. A practitioner who draws from sources entirely outside this reality's established hierarchy, who operates without demonic contract, without divine sanction, without the limitations that this universe's power framework imposes on everyone else who works within it. The smile again, thin and precise. Do you understand what that means, from our perspective? It means I'm ungoverned, Strange said. It means you're free, Asmodeus said. And the word landed with a specific weight. Not the weight of liberation, but the weight of allure. Carefully constructed, knowing exactly what it was made of. Every practitioner in this reality operates within a system. They draw from demonic sources, and they owe hell. They draw from divine sources, and they answer to heaven. They work with pagan power, and they're subject to those agreements. Even the most independent witch, a glance at Rowena that she received with magnificent indifference, is playing within rules she didn't write and can't revoke. Asmodeus looked at Strange. You aren't. Your power doesn't belong to this system. You can't be owned by it. Your proposition, Strange said, is based on the assumption that I want to operate in this universe long term. My proposition, Asmodeus said, is based on the understanding that getting back to your own universe requires navigating a reality that is currently responding to your presence as a foreign body. Heaven wants to contain you. The reality itself, the smile acquired a new quality, something that knew more than it was. Showing has already sent something to assess you. And the only faction in this universe that has both the knowledge of dimensional mechanics and the motivation to help you rather than neutralize you is the one making this offer. The silence that followed had a specific texture, the silence of a room full of experienced people, recognizing that an enemy had just made a technically accurate argument. Strange was aware of Dean's jaw tightening. He was aware of Sam's hand, flexing on the demon-killing knife with the specific tell of a man, preventing himself from acting before he'd fully processed the situation. He was aware of Rowena's expression, which had gone carefully neutral in the way of a woman who was also running the logic of the argument and not entirely disliking its conclusions, which was its own kind of warning. What does hell want in exchange, Strange said, for this assistance? Asmodeus moved for the first time, a slow, deliberate step further into the room. Not aggressive, the body language of someone, demonstrating that they could approach and were choosing to do so at the pace of a negotiation rather than a confrontation. Information, he said. Specifically, detailed accounts of the dimensional mechanics governing your home reality, the pathways between universes, the structure of the multiverse as you understand it. Hell wants a map, Sam said flatly. Hell wants knowledge, Asmodeus said, with the tone of a man making a distinction he found important. The difference between a map and knowledge is that knowledge enables independent navigation. We're not asking for access to your universe. We're asking for understanding of how a multiverse functions. The smile returned. Think of it as academic exchange. Strange looked at Asmodeus for a long moment with the full weight of his analytical attention. He had negotiated with Dormammu, with the entities of the dark dimension, with cosmic abstracts that made princes of hell look like local bureaucrats. He knew the specific shape of an offer that was designed to sound like exchange and function like surrender. No, he said. Asmodeus's composure didn't shift. Dr. Strange, the information you're describing, Strange said, with the measured patience of a professor, correcting a fundamental misconception, would give hell navigational framework for dimensional transit. between universes. You're not asking for academic knowledge. You're asking for the cosmological equivalent of a lockpick set for every door in the multiverse. He paused. I've seen what entities with that knowledge do with it. The answer is no. The room recalibrated. Dean's posture shifted fractionally, the specific shift of a man whose assessment of someone had moved upward. Asmodeus was quiet for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Strange watched the negotiator's mask do something interesting. It didn't fall exactly, but it settled, became less performative, became the expression of something, deciding to stop pretending that the conversation was going in a direction it had always known it wasn't going. Then we have a problem, Asmodeus said. Because the alternative to hell's assistance is heaven's containment, and the alternative to both is, he glanced upward, meaningfully, toward where Ishim stood with its wide eyes. Whatever heaven sends next. I am, whatever you think of my motivations, the option that keeps you operational. Rowena, Strange said, without looking away from Asmodeus. Ready, Rowena said. Now would be appropriate. Rowena spoke the binding in rapid, precise Scots, Gaelic mixed with what Strange recognized as a Latin framework running on a completely different grammatical logic than the Latin he knew. This universe's version of the language carrying a specific charge, that is, didn't, shaped by centuries of use as a magical instrument in a reality where words had intrinsic power, rather than simply serving as focusing mechanisms. She pressed the parchment with his blood to the war room table and completed the final sigil with a stroke of her finger that left a glowing trail. The binding hit Asmodeus like a physical force. The Prince of Hell staggered, actually staggered, 1 step backward, the composure cracking for a genuine half-second to reveal something old and vast and deeply irritated beneath it. Its eyes went fully black and then corrected, and it looked at the binding construct with the expression of an entity encountering a mechanism it didn't have a prepared response for. That's a foreign signature, it said, staring at the parchment. Its voice had lost the negotiator's smoothness, become something rawer. That's not from. No, Strange confirmed. It isn't. He stepped forward and added his own layer to Rowena's binding, not replacing it, but reinforcing it. His dimensional energy working with her blood and sacrifice framework in an improvised synthesis that neither system would have managed alone. The combination held Asmodeus in place with the grinding, effortful quality of 2 incompatible grammars, somehow producing a coherent sentence through sheer insistence. 12 minutes, Rowena had said. With Strange reinforcement, he estimated closer to 18. Asmodeus looked at Strange from within, the binding with something that had moved entirely past the negotiator's mask, past the infernal politician's careful effect, to something that was simply old and cold and absolutely certain of its own eventual victory. You understand, it said quietly, that refusing hell's offer doesn't make you free. It makes you alone. I've been alone in worse universes than this one, Strange said. You haven't, Asmodeus said, with simple, total conviction. Not like what's coming for you here. Not like what this universe grows in its darkest places. It paused. You felt it outside, didn't you? The third presence. The one you didn't have a category for. Strange said nothing. It has a category, Asmodeus said. Everything in this universe has a category. Dr. Strange, whether you know it yet or not. And the category for what's been watching you since the moment you arrived is the one that makes princes of hell reconsider their territorial ambitions. A last pause, precise and weighted. It's older than angels, older than demons, older than the current iteration of this reality. And it finds you. The cold eyes held Strange steadily, fascinating. The binding pulsed. Asmodeus said nothing further, but its eyes, for the remaining 17 minutes of containment, never moved from Strange's face. Dean waited until he was certain the binding was holding, and then turned to look at Strange, with the direct, pragmatic assessment of a man processing new information against existing risk calculations. The thing outside, he said. The third one. You felt it. Cass felt it. He looked at Castiel. What is older than angels and older than demons in this universe? Castiel was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to confirm that he knew the answer and was deciding how to say it. The empty, he said finally. or something that was present before the empty, before God's creation, something that existed in the space, between the first concept of existence and the first act of creating. He paused. We called them the forgotten in the oldest celestial records, not because they were forgotten by heaven, but because they forgot themselves, entities so old that the concept of continuous identity became. He searched, too heavy to maintain. They're aware, though, Sam said. Currently aware. One of them is, Castiel said. Apparently. Strange was running the math on every dimension of the problem simultaneously, the bound. Prince of Hell with 18 minutes of containment remaining. The angel in the room with an institutional mandate to neutralize him. The forgotten outside with attention he didn't yet understand. And the central practical problem of getting back to his own universe without giving Hell a map of the multiverse or heaven, an excuse to consider permanent containment. The efficient solution. He looked at Rowena. Your translation framework for cross-traditional magical systems, he said. How complete is it? 70%, she said. Perhaps 75. I need to understand the mechanics of dimensional transit as this universe understands it, he said. Not how I do it, how this reality's own framework conceptualizes, moving between worlds. If there's a native mechanism, I can potentially adapt my sling ring to work with it rather than against it. Rowena's expression shifted into the focused, lit quality of a woman being given a problem genuinely worthy of her attention. The men of letters had records, she said, already moving toward the archive shelves. Cases of entities that crossed between realities. The cosmological theory is incomplete, but start with what you have, Strange said. He looked then at Castiel, and the look carried a question he needed, answered and wasn't certain he'd like the answer to. The forgotten outside, he said. If it makes contact, if it approaches directly, what does it want? What do entities that old want? Castiel met his eyes steadily. To understand, he said, in the way that a fire understands wood. Strange nodded once. Turned back to the problem set. Outside the bunker, in the Kansas dark above 40 feet of rock. Something that had been old when the concept of age was new settled its attention more firmly on the point of light in the underground dark, the foreign brightness of a man who had walked through the spaces between everything and emerged, improbably still himself, and it waited with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry, for him to run out of options. The men of letters archive on dimensional transit occupied 3 folders in a fireproof cabinet that Sam had to unlock, with a key kept on a chain around his neck, which told Strange something about how seriously the organization had treated the subject even before its institutional collapse. The folders contained 40 years of case files, theoretical frameworks, and field reports accumulated by researchers who had encountered dimensional anomalies with enough frequency to develop methodology, but not enough frequency to develop confidence. The specific intellectual posture of people who knew they were looking at something real and vast and were honest enough to admit they'd only mapped the coastline. Strange read through the relevant material in 11 minutes, which Sam noted with the expression of a man recalibrating his reading speed assumptions upward. The men of letters theory was incomplete, and in several places wrong in ways that were understandable given the observational limitations of researchers who couldn't actually traverse the phenomena they were studying. But it was wrong in the specific, productive way that a map drawn from shore-based observation is wrong about ocean depth. The coastline was accurate. The framework for how this universe conceptualized dimensional transit was present in the data even where the data misidentified the mechanism. This universe moved between realities through sacrificial anchoring, not always consciously, not always deliberately, but the pattern across every documented case was consistent. Dimensional transit in this reality required an exchange, a cost paid to the fabric of the universe in exchange for permission to move through it. Angels used divine authority as their transit medium, which was itself a form of the principle they moved between dimensions, because heaven had paid for that. Right in the original architecture of creation, demons used corrupted versions of the same infrastructure, piggybacking on the original divine transit network through the degraded pathways of Hell's own construction. humans who had accidentally crossed realities. The cases were rare but present, had universally done so at moments of extreme personal crisis, which Strange now understood as the universe, accepting grief or desperation, or love as a form of payment. His sling ring operated on pure dimensional geometry. No sacrifice, no exchange, no cost paid to the local metaphysical economy, which was why it had misfired here, not because the ring was broken, but because it had tried to open a door in a wall that operated on a completely different principle than geometry. The ring understood angles and distances and the mathematical relationship between dimensional membranes. This universe's transit system understood that. He explained this to Rowena while she cross-referenced her translation framework against the men of letters, theoretical material, and watched her expression move through 3 stages: initial comprehension, the specific excitement of a theorist seeing 2 systems suddenly resolve into a unified framework, and then the slower, more complicated recognition of what the practical implication meant. "You need to pay something," she said, "to leave. I need to interface the sling ring with this universe's transit logic." Strange said, "Which means yes, some form of exchange. The question is the currency." "In this universe," Sam said from across the table, not looking up from the file he was cross-referencing, "the currency is usually something you don't want to give." "It's always something you don't want to give," Dean said. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, the Colt holstered now, watching Strange with the specific attention he'd been maintaining since the bunker, that ongoing assessment of a man deciding how much to trust someone, based on cumulative data rather than initial impression. That's how deals work here. The thing you're willing to give isn't worth anything. The thing you'd rather keep, that's the price. Strange looked at him steadily. "That's a transactional cosmology. That's just how it is," Dean said. "Not with bitterness, exactly. With the flat, worn quality of a man who had made too many of those transactions and was still calculating whether they'd balanced." Rowena had moved to a separate section of her grimoire and was writing rapidly, the notation dense and precise. "There's a theoretical framework in the Grand Coven's restricted archive," she said, without looking up, "for what they called sympathetic dimensional anchoring. The principle is that a practitioner can establish a temporary resonance with a transit pathway by offering something that functions as collateral rather than permanent payment. Not a deal, a loan, with interest." She paused, pen moving. "The interest is the part that kills most people who attempt it." "What's the interest rate?" Strange asked. "It varies based on how foreign the construction. Humans who had accidentally crossed realities. The cases were rare but present, had universally done so at moments of extreme personal crisis, which Strange now understood as the universe, accepting grief or desperation, or love as a form of payment. His sling ring operated on pure dimensional geometry. No sacrifice, no exchange, no cost paid to the local metaphysical economy, which was why it had misfired here, not because the ring was broken, but because it had tried to open a door in a wall that operated on a completely different principle than geometry. The ring understood angles and distances and the mathematical relationship between dimensional membranes. This universe's transit system understood that. He explained this to Rowena while she cross-referenced her translation framework against the men of letters, theoretical material, and watched her expression move through 3 stages: initial comprehension, the specific excitement of a theorist seeing 2 systems suddenly resolve into a unified framework, and then the slower, more complicated recognition of what the practical implication meant. "You need to pay something," she said, "to leave. I need to interface the sling ring with this universe's transit logic." Strange said, "Which means yes, some form of exchange. The question is the currency." "In this universe," Sam said from across the table, not looking up from the file he was cross-referencing, "the currency is usually something you don't want to give." "It's always something you don't want to give," Dean said. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, the Colt holstered now, watching Strange with the specific attention he'd been maintaining since the bunker, that ongoing assessment of a man deciding how much to trust someone, based on cumulative data rather than initial impression. That's how deals work here. The thing you're willing to give isn't worth anything. The thing you'd rather keep, That's the price. Strange looked at him steadily. That's a transactional cosmology. That's just how it is, Dean said. Not with bitterness, exactly. With the flat, worn quality of a man who had made too many of those transactions and was still calculating whether they'd balanced. Rowena had moved to a separate section of her grimoire and was writing rapidly, the notation dense and precise. There's a theoretical framework in the Grand Coven's restricted archive, she said, without looking up, for what they called sympathetic dimensional anchoring. The principle is that a practitioner can establish a temporary resonance with a transit pathway by offering something that functions as collateral rather than permanent payment, not a deal, a loan with interest. She paused, pen moving. The interest is the part that kills most people who attempt it. What's the interest rate? Strange asked. It varies based on how foreign the practitioner's power is to the local system. Rowena said, standard human. Practitioner attempting unauthorized transit, manageable. Something like you, she looked up, whose power comes from entirely outside this reality's framework, she returned to the notation. The interest could be significant. Significant meaning what? Meaning the universe takes something proportional to how much your presence has disrupted its natural order, Rowena said. You've been here for several hours. You've attracted 3 categories of supernatural response, reinforced a binding on a prince of hell with foreign dimensional energy, and sent a perceptual ward through 40 feet of this reality's substrate. The disruption cost is, she calculated, not trivial. We'll come back to that, Strange said. What else do we need? Time, Sam said. And a specific transit point. The men of letters cases suggest that dimensional crossings aren't random, they happen at locations where the membrane is naturally thin. The same locations, repeatedly, across different cases. There are 3 within driving distance of Lebanon. He spread a marked topographical map across the war room table. An abandoned rail junction outside of Salina. A reservoir northwest of Concordia that the local indigenous tradition identifies as a place where worlds touch, and a specific point in the Flint Hills that's been flagged in 3 separate men of letters case files over 40 years as a site of recurring dimensional anomaly. Strange looked at the map and ran a localized version of his perceptual ward, condensed and directed rather than expansive, pushing it along the dimensional substrate to sense which of the 3 locations resonated most strongly with his sling ring's frequency. The ward came back with a clear answer, the Flint Hills site, where the membrane was thin in the specific way that matched the harmonic of his own dimensional signature, like a key finding not a lock but the memory of its own shape pressed into the metal. The Flint Hills site, he said. That's 4 hours from here, Dean said. Maybe 3.5 if I drive. You'll drive faster than that, Strange said. Dean looked at him. You've been in the car for 30 seconds total, and you're already. The binding on Asmodeus has approximately 4 minutes remaining, Strange said, after which a prince of hell who was already irritated before containment will be free in your bunker. I'd suggest we begin relocating. Dean moved toward the garage with the economical speed of a man who had made rapid departures from compromised positions often enough that the motion was entirely automatic. Sam was already gathering the relevant files. Rowena was closing her grimoire with practiced efficiency. Castiel remained where he had been, and Ishim remained where it had been, and the 2 angels looked at each other across the war room with the specific quality of a conversation that had been deferred through the operational necessity of the last several hours and was now arriving at the moment it could no longer be avoided. You're going to let him leave? Ishim said to Castiel. Not a question. He was brought here involuntarily, Castiel said. He's caused no harm. He has, in fact, a fractional pause, been cooperative and tactically useful. He exists outside heaven's jurisdiction, Ishim said. He draws from power sources that we cannot monitor or govern. His departure returns him to a reality where he operates entirely, without oversight and his knowledge of our universe's transit mechanics. He's not taking anything, Castiel said. He's leaving. The distinction between those 2 things, Ishim said, is one you've always been more comfortable with than heaven has. Heaven's comfort, Castiel said quietly, has historically not been my primary navigational tool. Strange had paused at the base of the stairs, listening to this exchange with the full attention he gave to all information that might be operationally relevant. He looked at Castile, at the specific quality of isolation that the angel carried, the exile's particular posture of someone who had chosen principle over belonging often enough that the choice had become identity, and recognized something he had no immediate use for and filed carefully anyway. Castile, he said. The angel looked at him. Thank you, Strange said. The words were simple and direct, and he meant them with the uncomplicated sincerity of someone who didn't say them carelessly. Castile nodded once, with the gravity of a being for whom gratitude from mortals, or near mortals, or whatever Strange qualified as, carried genuine weight. The binding on Asmodeus made a sound like a cable under tension, approaching its limit. Now, Strange said, and followed Dean up the stairs. The Impala existed in the specific category of objects that had accumulated so much history that they'd crossed the threshold from vehicle to artifact. Strange could feel it the moment he got into the back seat. The car's reality denser and more present than its physical components should have produced, layered with years of everything the Winchesters had carried through it: grief, determination, the specific kind of hope that survives by not calling itself hope. It smelled like leather and gun oil and old coffee and something else, something Strange identified after a moment as the ambient residue of protection spells cast and recast over years until they'd become structural. Rowena got into the back beside him with her satchel and her grimoire and the particular self-possession of a woman who had ridden in worse company under worse circumstances. Dean started the engine, and the Impala's rumble settled into the Kansas pre-dawn with the confidence of something that had earned its right to take up space in the world. For hours, Dean said. 3, Strange said. 3.5, Sam said, from the passenger seat, with the tone of a man mediating a negotiation he found slightly ridiculous. Dean pulled onto the highway and pressed the accelerator with the specific commitment of a man who understood that speed was sometimes the only variable he could control. The flat Kansas landscape opened around them, gray and wide under a sky beginning to consider dawn, and Strange looked out the window at the passing dark and ran calculations on transit costs and dimensional resonance and the forgotten thing that was somewhere out there in the pre-morning dark, following. Because it was following, he'd confirmed that when he stepped out of the bunker, the temperature less non-present quality of its attention had shifted from stationary observation to directional movement, keeping pace with them at a distance that was respectful in the way that a very large, very patient thing is respectful when it has decided that patience is still the correct strategy. He didn't mention this to the Winchesters yet. There was enough in motion for the next 3.5 hours. But he kept his awareness extended behind the Impala in a thin, careful thread, monitoring the quality of that attention, measuring whether patient was transitioning towards something else. Rowena, who was watching him with the peripheral awareness of an experienced practitioner who noticed things, leaned slightly toward him in the back seat. "It's following us," she said quietly, low enough that the front seat couldn't hear over the engine. "Yes," Strange said. "Do you know what it wants yet?" Strange considered Castile's answer. "To understand, in the way that a fire understands wood." "Working on it," he said. Outside, the Flint Hills were 3.5 hours ahead, the membrane thin and waiting, and the Kansas dark moved past the Impalas. Windows like something that had been listening to this conversation for longer than any of them had been in it. The Flint Hills arrived the way Kansas always arrived, gradually, then completely. The landscape changed from the flat agricultural geometry of central Kansas into something older and less managed, the land rising into long, rolling grassland ridges that had never been broken by a plow because the soil underneath was too thin for crops and the rock too close to the surface. The tall grass prairie moved in the pre-dawn wind with the slow, collective motion of something breathing, and Strange watched it through the Impala's window and felt the dimensional membrane thinning around them the way a diver feels pressure change on a scent, not dramatic, not sudden, but present and accumulating. The physics of the place becoming gradually more permeable to his specific frequency of perception. Dean had driven with the focused, economical aggression of a man for whom highways were tactical environments rather than scenic routes, and they'd made it in 3 hours and 12 minutes, which Strange noted and Dean didn't acknowledge because acknowledging it would have required admitting he'd been trying to prove a point. The specific location the men of letters files identified was a shallow depression between two long grass ridges, accessible by a dirt road that the Impala navigated with the confident certainty of a vehicle that had been down worse roads in worse conditions and considered this mild. They stopped where the road ended at a cattle gate, rusted open and clearly unused for years, and got out into the cold pre-dawn air. Strange felt it immediately, the specific quality of this location's dimensional membrane, thinner than the surrounding area by a measurable degree. The fabric of this universe's reality worn to near translucence by whatever accumulation of transit events had occurred here over decades and centuries. It sang at the frequency closest to his sling rings harmonic of anything he'd encountered since arriving. Not perfect resonance. This universe's membrane had its own character, its own specific texture built from the transit logic of sacrifice and exchange, but close enough to work with, close enough, potentially, to go home. He stood in the tall grass with the cloak moving around him in the pre-dawn wind and took a full inventory of what he had and what he needed. The sling ring was functional. He could feel its geometric sensitivity, responding to the location, trying to map the membrane's topology the way it always did, searching for the mathematical relationship between this point and the point he wanted to reach. But the mapping kept sliding, kept losing resolution at the crucial threshold where his dimensional geometry met this universe's transit logic, the two systems failing to achieve the handshake that would open a stable portal. Rowena was already working, her grimoire open on the Impala's hood, the wind trying to turn pages she was holding flat with one hand while writing with the other. She had the translation framework open beside the sympathetic dimensional anchoring theory and was building something. In her notation, a bridge document, Strange realized, a piece of magical theory written to exist simultaneously in both systems. Her own universe's grammar and his. A Rosetta Stone for dimensional transit. It was genuinely impressive work. He told her so. I know, she said, without looking up. Sam had established a perimeter of devil's traps in the tall grass, salt lines at the cardinal points, and was checking the load in the demon-killing knife with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that operational preparation was the difference between surviving the next hour and not. Dean was doing what Dean Winchester apparently did when there was nothing immediately requiring his hands. He was watching the ridgeline with the Colt in his jacket pocket and a coffee thermos that had materialized from somewhere in the Impala, and he was thinking, and Strange had learned enough about Dean Winchester in the last several hours to understand that the thinking was the most dangerous thing Dean did, because it was quiet and thorough, and arrived at conclusions that other people's louder thinking missed. The cost, Dean said, without turning from the ridgeline. Rowena said the universe takes something proportional to the disruption. You know what that means for you specifically? I have a working theory, Strange said. What's the theory? Strange looked at the thinning membrane and ran the calculation he'd been running since Rowena had explained the sympathetic anchoring principle. The disruption his presence had caused was quantifiable, the angelic response, the demonic engagement, the activation of whatever the forgotten was, the reinforcement binding on Asmodeus, the perceptual wards he'd run through the reality's substrate. Each of those was a cost in this universe's economic framework, a debt accrued against his foreign presence. The sympathetic anchoring process would require him to offer collateral, something genuine, something that this universe's transit logic would recognize as having real value, and the interest rate on that collateral was calculated against the total disruption debt. In my reality, Strange said, the Ancient One taught that the cost of drawing from dimensional power was always paid in time, not time as abstraction, actual moments of experience, of perception, of being alive to the specific texture of existence. You give up fragments of awareness in exchange for power. Most practitioners never notice because the increments are small. He paused. The sympathetic anchoring process requires a larger payment. This universe's logic will take something proportional, a period of memory, most likely, a significant one, something this reality judges as having genuine personal weight. Dean turned from the ridgeline and looked at Strange directly. It takes memories. It takes experience, Strange said. The distinction matters. Not the factual record. I'll still know what happened. The felt quality of the experience. The emotional texture. He considered how to say the next part accurately. In my reality, I watched 14 million possible futures to find the one path to victory against Thanos. That experience, the accumulation of 14 million iterations of loss and failure and watching people I care about die in different configurations, I carry that. The weight of it. This universe's transit logic will likely identify that as the highest value collateral. I carry and take a portion of it. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the silence of people who understood what it meant to carry that kind of weight and what it meant to potentially lose the felt memory of it. Does it hurt? Sam asked. He asked it with the directness of someone who had personal experience with having things taken from him and wanted accurate information rather than reassurance. I don't know, Strange said. In my universe, time costs are gradual and unnoticed. This would be more deliberate. The universe will take what it judges appropriate, and I won't have input into the selection. He paused. It may take something else entirely. The calculation isn't precise. But you're doing it anyway, Dean said. I need to go home, Strange said simply. Dean looked at him for a moment. With the specific expression Strange had come to associate with Dean Winchester reaching a conclusion he hadn't fully intended to reach. Then he nodded once, the way people nodded when they recognized a decision they couldn't argue with because they'd made the same kind themselves. Rowena looked up from the grimoire. I have a partial bridge document, she said. It's not complete. I'd want another 6 hours to make it properly. But it should be sufficient to help the sling ring interface with the local transit logic. The anchoring process will still extract its cost, but the bridge will reduce the interface friction and give you a cleaner portal. She paused. There's a complication. One complication, Dean said. We're doing well. The bridge document requires activation by something native to this universe's power framework. Rowena said, my magic will do most of it, but the final anchoring step needs a touch of divine or infernal energy to ratify the transit in terms the local system recognizes. She looked at Dean. We need Castile. Dean was already reaching for his phone. The call lasted 45 seconds. Strange heard Dean's side of it, terse, directional. The communication of two people who had developed a language of emergency over years of emergencies. He heard Castile's voice through the phone as a distant, layered sound, and then heard the atmospheric pressure shift of angelic arrival before Dean had finished putting the phone back in his pocket. Castile appeared at the edge of the salt perimeter, looked at the permission question silently, and Sam broke the line to let him through. The angel walked to where Rowena was working and looked at the bridge document with the careful attention of a being for whom written magical frameworks were legible in ways they weren't to human eyes. This is, he started. Functional, Rowena said firmly. Partially, Castile amended. Sufficiently, Rowena said, with the tone of a woman who had moved past the phase of accepting peer review. Strange was at the center of the depression. The grass flattened around him in a rough circle by the same consistent wind that had been blowing since they arrived, and he had the sling ring in his hands and was feeling the membranes topology with the full weight of his perceptual attention, mapping it not with geometric precision but with something closer to intuition, letting the ring respond to the location the way an instrument responds to acoustics rather than calculating the room's dimensions mathematically. He felt the moment the forgotten arrived. It came from the east, from the direction of the rising sun that was beginning to consider, appearing below the horizon, and it arrived not with the directional movement of an approaching entity, but with the quality of a presence that had always been there, becoming suddenly visible, like a figure in a painting that you suddenly notice has been looking directly at you across the entire room. The temperature-less, non-present attention that he'd been monitoring since the bunker was no longer at a respectful distance. It was here, at the edge of the depression, occupying a space that his perceptual awareness registered, but his eyes found nothing to focus on. It's here, Strange said quietly. Everyone's attention changed, the specific quality of experienced hunters and an angel responding to a threat that none of them had a prepared protocol for. Dean's hand went to the Colt with the automatic response of a man who knew the Colt was probably useless and reached for it anyway, because the alternative was reaching for nothing. Don't, Strange said. Not sharply, informatively. It hasn't acted. It's observing. He turned to face the direction his perception identified as the Forgotten's location, and looked at what appeared to be empty tall grass moving in the pre-dawn wind, and understood that looking was not the right instrument for this particular encounter. He closed his eyes. With his eyes closed, the Forgotten was visible in the way that radio waves are visible to the right receiver, not seen but received, a pattern his perceptual awareness could resolve into something like shape, old, genuinely old, in a way that Asmodeus's infernal age hadn't been. That had been the age of something that had lived through a long time. This was the age of something that had existed before time had developed enough consistency to be lived through. It had a quality of incompleteness, of unfinished definition, as though identity itself was a technology it hadn't fully adopted. And it was curious, not hungry, not in the consumptive way Castiel's description had implied. Curious in the specific way of something that had encountered very few genuinely new things in its existence and was experiencing the disorientation and fascination of novelty. Strange opened his eyes. It wants to understand what I am, he said. Not consume. Understand. Castiel said. Sam started. Castiel's information was heaven's information, Strange said. Heaven categorized it based on what it does to things that belong to this universe. I don't belong to this universe. He paused, working through the implication. To something native to this reality. An outside practitioner's power would look like fire. To something old enough to predate this reality's construction. He considered, I might look like something else entirely. He turned back to the membrane, the sling ring warm in his damaged hands. Rowena, Castiel, I need the bridge document. Activated in the next few minutes. Whatever the Forgotten wants to understand. I'd prefer to not be here long. Enough for it to decide understanding. Requires a more direct approach. Rowena began the activation sequence, her voice moving through the notation in rapid, precise cadences. The bridge document's framework lighting with the specific charge of her magic. That blood and sacrifice quality. Personal and costly and genuine. Castiel placed 2 fingers on the document's final sigil and added the ratifying touch of divine energy. A thin, cold light that made the whole framework momentarily visible as a 3-dimensional structure hanging over the Impala's hood. The sling ring in Strange's hands began to move. Not with the smooth, responsive geometry of his home reality, with effort, with that resistant thickness he'd been working against since arrival, pushing through the dimensional substrate's resistance like turning a key in a lock that wasn't made for it, but moving. The portal forming not as a clean golden mandala, but as something hybrid, his geometry filtered through this universe's transit logic, angular and precise, but carrying at its edges the specific charge of exchange, of cost acknowledged, of the local system's grammar incorporated into the structure. The Forgotten moved. Strange felt it before anyone else. Registered it, the quality of its attention shifting from observation to something more active, the pre-technology equivalent of leaning forward. It wasn't threatening. It was urgent, in the way of something that had decided it was running out of time to ask a question. And then, with a clarity that bypassed language entirely and arrived as direct perceptual information, Strange understood what it was asking. It wanted to know if there were others, outside this universe, in the multiverse Strange came from, others like itself, old, pre-definitional, existing in the spaces between realities rather than within them. It had been alone, Strange understood, for longer than this universe had existed. It was asking if that was necessary. Strange held the question in his attention for 3 full seconds. The portal growing, the membrane thinning at the point his ring had identified. Rowena's bridge document burning down toward its conclusion. Castiel's divine energy ratifying the transit framework. Dean and Sam watching with weapons they couldn't use against something they couldn't see. He made a choice. Not the Sorcerer Supreme's choice, not the strategic, calculated response of the guardian of his reality's dimensional stability. The choice of a man who had spent 14 million futures watching people die alone and understood, at a cellular level, what that cost. He reached toward the Forgotten's presence with his perceptual awareness. Not his power, not his magic, simply his attention, and answered, yes, there are others, not the same, but old, and aware, and present in the spaces between. The Forgotten was still for one complete moment. Then it receded, not leaving. Exactly, but becoming less proximate. Its attention shifting from urgent to something quieter. Something that Strange, if pressed, would have called contemplative. It pulled back to its previous, respectful distance and became again the temperature-less watching presence. At the edge of perception, but with a different quality now, less the focused attention of a predator, and more the unfocused attention of something that had received information. It needed time to process. Strange exhaled. What just happened? Dean asked. Diplomacy, Strange said, and turned to the portal. It was open, imperfect, flickering at the edges where his geometry and this universe's transit logic hadn't fully reconciled. But open, a mandala of gold and violet. His system in this universe's native frequency, braided into something that was neither and both. Through it he could see the dimensional membrane of his own reality, the specific harmonic of home, and beyond that the architectural presence of the multiverse's deeper structure, familiar and immense and ordered in the way that brought something loose in his chest back to its proper position. He felt the cost begin immediately. Not pain, not exactly. A subtraction. The universe reaching into the weight he carried and taking its proportional measure. And he had been right about what it took. It took from 14 million. Took from the accumulated iterations of loss and failure and watching. Reduced the felt weight of that experience by some portion he couldn't quantify precisely. He'd know the facts when he returned. He'd know he'd watched those futures. The visceral, carried weight of each individual failure would be thinner. Some fraction of the darkness he'd earned through those iterations, given to a universe as payment for the right to leave it. He wasn't certain if that was loss or grace. Possibly both. He turned to the Winchesters, to Rowena, to Castiel. The sympathetic anchoring. Record, he said to Sam, your analysis of the cross-traditional interference patterns. He looked at Rowena, documented. All of it. The bridge framework especially. It may be relevant to future transit. Anomalies, and you should have the complete theory rather than the partial version the men of letters left you. Sam was already reaching for a notebook. Strange looked at Castiel. What you said about the Forgotten, that heavens record, characterized them as consumptive. That record is incomplete. They're not consuming. They're asking. He paused. That distinction may matter eventually. Castiel held his gaze with the steady attention of a being filing that information in the category of things that would prove important in ways not yet visible. Strange looked at Dean last. Dean Winchester, who had made coffee at 2 a.m. with cosmic forces bearing down on his home, who had asked, can you fight rather than can you use magic, who carried the specific exhaustion of someone who had been paying this universe's transactional costs for so long that the math had become simply the shape of his life. The cost this universe charges, Strange said. You've been paying it a long time. Dean looked at him with the flat, direct expression of a man who didn't need that acknowledged and was deciding how he felt about someone, acknowledging it anyway. Yeah, he said. It doesn't balance, Strange said. For the record, what it takes from you doesn't balance against what you give. He meant it as simple, accurate information, the assessment of someone who had briefly seen the ledger clearly. That's not an accounting error. It's just true. Dean was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, he said again. Different register. The word doing more work. Strange stepped toward the portal. The cloak settled around his shoulders with the specific quality it had when it was satisfied with a decision. And he reached the threshold and felt the pull of his own reality on the other side. Home. The sanctum. The dimensional architecture he'd spent years learning to navigate. The work that was waiting. He paused at the threshold and looked back one final time at the four of them standing in the tall grass in the Flint Hills. Pre-dawn, the brothers, and the witch and the angel. For people who had been fighting a universe that charged everything and gave nothing back, and who kept fighting anyway with a stubbornness that had long since passed the threshold of rational calculation and become something else entirely. Something Strange thought that his universe would call heroism, and this universe probably just called Thursday. He stepped through. The portal didn't close cleanly. Strange had expected some resistance. The hybrid geometry of the transit framework, his system braided with this universe's sacrificial logic, was always going to be less stable than a pure dimensional mandala. But what happened as he crossed the threshold was more significant than instability. The portal stretched behind him like a wound refusing to seal, its violet gold edges flickering, with the specific, distressed signature of a transit pathway that hadn't completed its cost accounting, the universe's logic still calculating, still reaching, finding that the memory extraction had been insufficient payment for something Strange hadn't fully accounted for in his disruption ledger. He was halfway between realities when it pulled him back. Not violently, not the catastrophic reversal of a failed transit, which he had experienced twice before and which felt like being turned inside out by something that didn't understand human anatomy. Transit logic closing around his ankle like a hand, patient and absolute, saying, "Not yet. The accounting isn't finished." He hung in the membrane between worlds for 3 seconds that felt significantly longer. The portal held open by the bridge document's residual framework, his home reality visible ahead of him, with the specific clarity of something just out of reach. And he ran the calculation with the concentrated urgency of a man who understood that existing in the space between realities for extended periods had consequences that were deeply unpleasant and permanent. The disruption debt was larger than he'd estimated. He'd missed an item, the forgotten, the diplomatic contact, the perceptual exchange, the answer he'd given to a pre-universal entity about the nature of the multiverse. Outside this reality, that exchange had not been neutral. In this universe's transactional framework, giving information of that magnitude, the confirmation that other ancient entities existed outside its borders, information that could fundamentally alter a pre-universal being's behavior and relationship to this reality's structure, was a cost. Significant. The universe had been waiting for him to recognize it and pay it, and he'd walked toward the portal without doing so. He had 11 seconds, roughly, before the membrane's resistance exceeded the bridge document's ability to hold the portal open. He went still in the space between and assessed what he had left to offer. The memory extraction had taken its portion of 14 million futures. His technical knowledge, the dimensional mathematics, the sling ring mechanics, the Kamartaj methodologies, those were functional, professional. And this universe's transit logic had shown no interest in professional knowledge. It wanted personal weight, genuine cost, the specific currency of things that mattered to the person paying. Strange had, in his experience, a limited inventory of things that mattered to him in the way this universe's logic recognized as valuable. His arrogance, which he'd never fully shed, had protected him from the kind of attachment that made for expensive collateral and transactional cosmologies. The Ancient One had noted this in his training, that his primary obstacle was not insufficient love, but insufficient willingness to acknowledge what he loved. He acknowledged it now, in the membrane between worlds, with the specific clarity that impossible situations occasionally granted. Christine Palmer, not the romantic aspiration he'd buried under professional identity before the accident, not the complicated history of their friendship after it, the genuine, specific, irreplaceable fact of her presence in his life as the person who had told him the truth about himself when no one else had bothered. The felt quality of that, the particular afternoon she'd sat across from him in a hospital break room and said, with complete calm, that he was the most gifted surgeon she'd ever seen and also one of the loneliest people, and that she wasn't sure he understood that those two things were related. He had dismissed it at the time with the efficiency of a man who had a system for dismissing accurate observations. He had carried the felt weight of that moment for years, the specific texture of it, the quality of being seen clearly by someone who had no obligation to see him at all. He offered it. The universe took it. Not all of it. Not the memory itself. Not the factual record of Christine or that afternoon or what she'd said. The felt quality, the specific emotional texture of being seen. It extracted cleanly, with the purposeful precision Strange now understood was characteristic of this realities. Transit logic, never arbitrary, always proportional, always taking exactly what it had calculated as appropriate and nothing more. The portal opened. He came through onto the other side like a man surfacing from deep water. The Flint Hills, grassland gone, replaced by the dimensional membrane of his own reality with its familiar, mathematical character, its geometric responsiveness, the specific harmonic of a universe whose physics he had spent years internalizing. He completed the transit and sealed the portal behind him with 3 precise gestures, the sling ring responding with its usual fluid immediacy now that it was home, the mandala closing cleanly and completely, and leaving behind only the faint ozone trace of dimensional passage. He stood in the alley, behind the Sanctum Sanctorum Inn, Greenwich Village, at what his internal chronology suggested was early afternoon, though he'd need to verify whether the transit had displaced him, temporally as well as spatially. The New York sounds, traffic, a distant siren, someone's music from a window above settled around him with the specific comfort of the familiar. He was home. He ran a diagnostic immediately, cataloging what had changed. The eye of Agamotto responded at his chest with its familiar amber warmth. The time stone's resonance restored. Home and recognized. His shields formed with the smooth, immediate responsiveness he was accustomed to. No resistant thickness, no dimensional friction. The sling ring in his hands felt calibrated and precise. His technical capacity was intact at full operational efficiency. He checked the memory extraction. 14 million futures. He knew he had watched them, knew the factual content of what he'd seen, understood the strategic significance of each. The weight of them was thinner. The visceral accumulation of failure and loss, and the specific darkness of watching the same people die across millions of iterations, reduced by the portion the supernatural universe had taken. He was not certain this was purely loss. He would need time to understand what it meant to carry that knowledge without the full weight of its felt experience. Christine. He knew who she was, knew the afternoon in the break room, knew what she'd said. He could reconstruct the factual content with his usual precision. The specific felt quality of that particular moment of being seen, that was gone. He noticed its absence the way you notice a tooth that's no longer there, with your tongue, in the specific hollow where something used to be. He stood with that for a moment. Then he moved. The sanctum's interior received him with the subtle responsiveness of a building that was partly aware, doors opening on the relevant floors. The library's ambient magical charge shifting to acknowledge his return. Wong appearing at the top of the main staircase with a cup of tea and an expression that contained precisely calibrated quantities of relief and professional exasperation. 14 hours, Wong said. It felt longer, Strange said. Where? Strange considered how to compress the operational summary of the last 14 hours into the format Wong would find most useful. A closed cosmological system, he said, ascending the stairs. Single deity creation framework. Divine and infernal hierarchies. Magic operating on transactional principles rather than dimensional geometry. No time-stone resonance. Sling ring produced unstable. Portals due to transit logic. Incompatibility. He reached the landing and took the tea. I made contact with 4 local operatives who were substantially more capable than their technological context would suggest. Engaged with angelic and infernal factions, one pre-universal entity, and a prince of hell. Resolved the transit issue through sympathetic, dimensional anchoring with bridge document. Assistance from a local practitioner of considerable skill. Wong was quiet for a moment. And the cost? Strange looked at him. Wong had studied under the ancient one long enough to understand that transit costs were real and personal, and not always immediately quantifiable. The transit logic took a portion of the felt weight of 14 million futures, Strange said, and a specific personal memory, not the factual content, the emotional texture. Which memory? Strange looked at the sanctum's stained glass, the light coming through, in the colors he'd memorized. Over years of standing in this exact spot at this exact time of afternoon. One I should have paid more attention to when it was fully intact, he said. The words carried an accuracy he found neither comfortable nor deniable. Wang nodded once, with the specific gravity of someone who understood that this was not a conversation to extend. The fracture you were closing when the transit occurred, he said, returning to operational mode with the professional precision Strange relied on. It's stable. I closed it with a secondary anchor 40 minutes after you disappeared. The empirical constructs that triggered it have been contained. Good, Strange said. There's a secondary anomaly developing in the Norwegian corridor, Wang said. Minor, but it needs assessment before it escalates. Give me an hour, Strange said. Wang raised an eyebrow. 45 minutes, Strange said. He went to the library, to his specific chair by the window that looked out onto Bleecker Street, and sat with the tea cooling in his hands and let himself be still for a moment that he estimated he had earned. The New York afternoon moved outside the window, with its usual complete indifference to the fact that its resident sorcerer, Supreme, had spent the previous 14 hours in a universe that charged everything and forgave nothing, had met 4 people who had been paying that universe's costs for years with a stubborn, graceless, deeply human persistence that had no strategic justification in every moral one, and had come back changed in ways that were small and specific and not yet fully understood. He thought about Dean Winchester making coffee at 2 a.m. He thought about Sam's careful scholarship, the specific quality of a mind that had turned to knowledge as both weapon and survival mechanism, and recognized in it something he'd spent years being too arrogant to acknowledge in himself. He thought about Rowena's architectural interest in his magic, genuine, covetous, brilliant, and honest about all 3 simultaneously. He thought about Castiel's isolated certainty, the angel who had chosen principle over belonging so many times that the choice had become identity, and who carried that not as tragedy but as the simple, settled fact of who he was. He thought about what he'd told Dean, that the cost doesn't balance, that it's not an accounting error. He'd meant it as simple, accurate information, and he recognized now, sitting in the sanctum's library with the tea going cold, that he'd also meant it as the thing he hadn't said, that paying anyway, knowing the accounting was wrong, was the specific definition of something he didn't have a clinical term for, but that the Winchesters apparently just called getting up in the morning. He looked at his hands, the scars from the accident, the tremor that had never fully resolved, that had redirected him from surgery to sorcery through the particular alchemy of loss becoming purpose. The supernatural universe had taken something from him. It had also, in the specific way of encounters that cost you something real, given him something he hadn't gone looking for and couldn't have calculated in advance. He finished the tea. He stood, straightened the cloak, which arranged itself with the brisk efficiency of something that had been patient long enough, and was ready to return to work. He had 43 minutes before Wang would reappear with the Norwegian corridor assessment, and there was something he needed to do first, something small, specific, and uncharacteristic, enough that he almost talked himself out of it before he'd finished deciding to do it. He went to the Sanctum's communication room and placed a call to Metro General Hospital. Christine Palmer answered on the 3rd ring, with the slightly distracted efficiency of someone between patients. Strange. Christine, he said, and paused, because what he'd called to say was simple and he was finding it surprisingly difficult, which confirmed that it was the right thing to say. I wanted to tell you that what you said to me in the break room, 3rd floor, the afternoon before the Mickelson conference, was accurate. What you observed. Another pause. I should have said that at the time. The silence on Christine's end lasted for seconds. Then, you're calling me to tell me I was right about something I said 6 years ago. Yes. Are you dying? Not currently. Are you in another dimension? Not anymore. Another pause, longer. When Christine spoke again, her voice had shifted into the register that Strange associated with her when she was deciding to accept something unusual rather than interrogate it. Okay, she said. Thank you for saying that. Yes, Strange said. He ended the call, stood in the communication room for a moment with the specific awareness that the felt quality of that exchange, the precise emotional texture of Christine's voice shifting into acceptance, was something he had, and that the universe he'd visited had not taken it, because it had not yet existed when he paid the transit cost. Perhaps that was how Grace worked in transactional cosmologies. Not balancing the ledger, just leaving room for new entries. He went to find Wong. 3 weeks after his return, Strange found the file on his desk, not placed there by Wong, who had a specific organizational system for Sanctum, documents that Strange had never fully adopted and Wong had never fully abandoned, hoping he would. Not generated by the Sanctum's own archival processes, which occasionally produced relevant documentation from its dimensional awareness of ongoing threats. This file had been left by the Sanctum itself, by the building's partial sentience, responding to something it had detected in Strange's own magical signature, a residual thread connecting him to a reality he'd passed through, thin as spider silk and precisely as strong as spider silk, which was considerably stronger than it had any right to be. He sat at his desk and opened it. The Sanctum had compiled what it could from the residual connection, fragmentary impressions, dimensional echoes, the specific harmonic of a universe that operated on transactional logic, bleeding faintly through the membrane at the point where Strange's transit had left its scar. Not information exactly, more like the memory of a smell, or the afterimage of a strong light, present, meaningful, impossible to fully articulate. What the Sanctum had compiled told him that in the 3 weeks since his departure, the supernatural universe had continued its accounting. The angelic faction had registered the forgotten's behavioral shift, its withdrawal from active proximity, its new contemplative posture, and had convened an emergency theological assessment that was, by the Sanctum's dimensional impression, going very badly for everyone involved, because none of the existing theological frameworks had a category for a pre-universal entity voluntarily choosing to recede, rather than being bound or destroyed. Heaven, Strange gathered, was not an institution that handled categorical novelty gracefully. Hell's accounting was simpler. Asmodeus, freed from the binding after its 18 minutes, had returned to whatever infernal structure he operated within and had filed. Strange interpreted the impression as something functionally equivalent to a report on the encounter with the foreign practitioner. The report's conclusion, as far as the Sanctum's impression could render it, was that dimensional transit from outside the universe's established hierarchy was theoretically possible but practically expensive, enough that Hell should develop countermeasures rather than capabilities, which was, Strange reflected, probably the most useful outcome for that universe's continued stability that Hell's involvement could have produced. Rowena's bridge document was the clearest impression in the file. The Sanctum read magical frameworks with considerably more precision than it read political situations, and what it returned from Rowena McLeod's work was a clear, detailed rendering of the theoretical structure sheet, completed and annotated in the 3 weeks since the Flint Hills. She had kept working. Of course she had. The bridge document was now 80% complete. She'd noted in her annotation that the remaining 20% required empirical testing that she was not, at present, in a position to conduct, and that she was filing the incomplete document in the Grand Covenant's restricted archive under a cipher she had invented personally, with a notation that it should not be accessed without her direct supervision. Strange read the theoretical framework with genuine professional admiration for someone working entirely from observation and translation rather than direct access to dimensional mechanics. Rowena McLeod had arrived at conclusions that were largely accurate and occasionally brilliant. The bridge document's core insight, that transit between universes with incompatible power logics required not overcoming the incompatibility but temporarily embodying both systems simultaneously, becoming the translation, rather than performing it, was a genuine theoretical contribution. He made a note to ensure that if the membrane between their realities ever thinned again, the Camartage Library had a record of her work. The impression of the Winchesters was the thinnest in the file. The Sanctum's dimensional awareness had less purchase on purely human signatures than on magical or celestial ones, but it was present, and what it rendered was not specific enough to be called information, and was instead something Strange recognized as the qualitative impression of people in motion. Sam and Dean Winchester were, 3 weeks after his departure from their universe, engaged in whatever they were always engaged in, The ongoing, unbalanced, non-negotiable business of paying costs they hadn't agreed to and fighting things they hadn't been asked to fight and getting up the following morning to do it again. The impression carried a specific quality he'd come to associate with the Winchesters specifically, that worn, stubborn, graceless persistence that had no strategic justification in every human one. Strange closed the file. He sat for a moment with his hands on the desk, the eye of Agamotto warm at his chest, the sanctum moving quietly around him with its partial awareness and its centuries of accumulated purpose. And he thought about transactional cosmologies, about universes that charged everything, about the specific arithmetic of people who kept paying anyway, not because the math balanced, but because the alternative was a kind of debt they found more expensive than anything the universe could extract. He thought about what he'd given the supernatural universe, the felt weight of 14 million failures, the emotional texture of being seen clearly by Christine on an ordinary afternoon. The universe had taken those things because they were valuable, which meant they had been valuable, which meant he'd been carrying them without fully acknowledging what they were. He wondered sometimes, in the weeks following, whether the transit cost had been designed, not by any intelligence, not by any intent, but by the specific logic of a universe built on sacrifice, recognizing what needed to be released, rather than what needed to be taken. Whether there was a difference between those two things, he was not certain. He was not certain he needed to be. Wong appeared in the doorway with the Norwegian corridor assessment and the specific expression of a man who had given Strange the 43 minutes he'd asked for and 17 additional minutes of personal consideration, and was now firmly in operational mode. Ready? Wong asked. Strange stood. The cloak settled around his shoulders with its characteristic brisk efficiency, and he felt the full weight of his capacity available to him, his magic, responsive and immediate, his shields precise, the eye of Agamotto resonant, with the time stones familiar, warmth, operational, present, home. Yes, Strange said, and meant it in more registers than Wong probably recognized and possibly more than Strange himself fully understood yet. They walked together toward the sanctum's lower levels, toward the Norwegian anomaly and the work that was always waiting, and the building moved around them with its partial sentience and its accumulated purpose. And in the library Strange had left behind, the file the sanctum had compiled sat closed on the desk, the dimensional thread that had produced it already thinning toward nothing. By morning it would be gone entirely. The connection between the two universes fading as connections did when the people who had made them moved in different directions through different kinds of time. What remained was harder to quantify. The specific adjustments Strange had made to his shield geometry, originally improvised to resonate with a foreign reality's magical frequencies, had integrated permanently into his standard defensive architecture, a refinement he hadn't been looking for, and that made his shields approximately 12% more adaptable to unfamiliar dimensional environments, useful, the product of necessity becoming capability in the way that Strange's entire history had been the product of necessity becoming capability, the theoretical understanding of sacrificial transit logic, not operational knowledge. He couldn't replicate Rowena's bridge document from memory with sufficient precision to use it, but the conceptual framework sat in his understanding of dimensional mechanics as a new variable, a reminder that not all cosmologies were built on geometry, that some universes ran on something older and less precise and uncertain, ways more honest about what power actually cost, and somewhere in the place where the felt quality of being seen clearly by Christine had been, there was a hollow that his tongue kept finding. That prompted him on 3 separate occasions in the following weeks to pick up the phone and call her for no operationally justifiable reason, to describe what he'd encountered, to ask her opinion on a theoretical problem, once simply to report that he'd had a difficult week and that he was, he thought, mostly fine. Christine, to her credit, received all 3 calls with the specific equanimity of someone who had long ago adjusted her baseline for what constituted normal contact from Stephen Strange, and found the new baseline, if slightly unusual, not unwelcome. He did not tell her what the universe had taken. He was not certain she needed to know, and he was not certain, if she knew, that he could. explain why he'd offered it, without it sounding like either more or less than it had been. It had been payment. It had been acknowledgement. It had been the specific, overdue admission that some things he'd carried at arm's length were worth carrying closer. The Norwegian anomaly turned out to be a minor incursion from the mindless ones. Dimensional predators. The same category he'd described to Castile when discussing the Forgotten. And Strange closed it in 11 minutes with Wong's assistance and the refined shield geometry that the supernatural universe had inadvertently improved. He stood afterward in the Norwegian coastal air, the North Sea gray and immense behind him, and looked at the closed membrane where the incursion had been, and thought for a moment about a universe four-dimensional, layers removed from this one where two brothers were driving a black car through somewhere, flat and cold, and were probably, statistically, in the middle of something impossible. He hoped they were fine. He recognized this as not a strategic calculation and not an operational assessment, but simply a thing he felt, which was its own kind of data. He turned back toward Wong and the work, and the cloak moved with him in the North Sea wind, and the membrane behind him held closed and clean and did not reopen. It did not need to. What had passed between those two universes had passed completely, and the accounting, for now, was settled. Stephen Strange returned to his own universe, lighter in specific places and heavier in others, carrying the productive residue of a reality that had charged him honestly and given him, in exchange, the specific education of a universe that never let anything go free. He had crossed into a world of transactional cosmology and emerged with his power intact, his understanding expanded, and a permanent refinement in his defenses built. From the necessity of adapting to foreign magic under pressure, the supernatural universe had taken portions of his heaviest burdens and left him with the hollow where they'd been, and in that hollow, Strange was discovering there was room for something he'd never budgeted for in the architecture of himself. Attention, presence, the ability to acknowledge what mattered before a transactional universe extracted it as payment, somewhere in the dimensional distance. In a universe that charged everything, a black car moved through flat American landscape toward the next impossible thing, and Strange, walking back toward Wong and the cold Norwegian air and the work that was always waiting, found that he carried that knowledge with the specific, unstrategic warmth of something that had no operational justification and did not require one. The multiverse was vast. The accounting was ongoing. And somewhere in the spaces between, something ancient and predefinitional was sitting with new information about whether it was alone and had not yet decided what to do with the answer.